Hey everyone, welcome to God's Plan Your Part Year 2, where this year we're reading through and studying the entire New Testament one chapter at a time. Thanks again for joining us in discovering God's plan and your part in it.
Today we are looking at John chapter 11, and it's probably one of the more famous things that Jesus did during his ministry. He is raising Lazarus from the dead. There's a few things that I noticed actually as we read over this that I had not really noticed before, and I'm excited to talk about this story.
So just a little bit of recap, I guess. Lazarus is actually the brother of Mary and Martha, yes?
Yes.
Okay, so there's actual family background here too. So it kind of hits home a little bit more with the interactions that are going on between Jesus and Martha, Jesus and Mary. And I think what's cool, if you remember back to us talking about Mary and Martha before, they have very different personalities, as most people and family members do. But it's interesting to see how they are, again, kind of dealing with the situation of the fact that their brother just died. So Martha is actually kind of waiting around for Jesus to get there. And as soon as she knows that he's there, she goes out immediately to take care of business. And then Mary just kind of sits inside to just I guess just wallow and sit in her feelings. It's so interesting because I would have totally called that based on how we have seen both of them interacting with Jesus in the past. So that was just some interesting, things that stood out when I was thinking about how they are kind of dealing with the fact that their brother has just died.
All right, so this story kicks off with essentially Mary and Martha sending word to Jesus that their brother is sick. At the beginning of chapter 11, he's just sick. And one of the things I noticed is that since we're obviously on the heels of reading chapter 10 yesterday, it's really important what he says about this. If you look at verse 4, so Jesus is finding out that Lazarus is sick. It says, "But when Jesus heard this, he said, 'This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God.'" The reason that's important is because he just said that about the man who was born blind. If you look at chapter 9, verse 3, it says, "Jesus answered, 'It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him.'" So this is like John threads so many common things chapter to chapter, and I had never seen it before. I'm seeing a lot of this stuff for the first time where he's just repeating these themes over and over. So here we have in chapter 11, Jesus saying hey, what you see happening in front of you, it's actually happening that God would be glorified, just like what you saw yesterday. Maybe it was yesterday, maybe it was a couple days before. Just like when you just recently saw this blind man receive his sight, that was for the glory of God too. So you're starting to get the idea that many of these things that are happening, they are so that God can be glorified, and Jesus is going to use them to bring everyone's attention to God. And you'll actually see, again, many people see Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, and they end up believing that he is the Son of God.
Well, what's interesting, too, is if you would have been one of the people to hear what Jesus said, I don't even know that I totally caught it when you were just reading it for the episode, but when it says this illness does not lead to death, that would actually require so much faith of anyone who heard it, because eventually when he does finally get there, this is old times where you don't just send a text message and immediately know what's going on.
What?
When Jesus actually finally arrives, it's been about 4 days since he has technically been dead. So the people that would have heard Jesus say that the illness is not going to lead to death would have to, if they really believed that, coming to find that Lazarus is dead, that would require so much faith to be no, that's not actually the case because Jesus said it's not.
Yeah, that's true.
So
that's
that
true.
is kind of insane. I can't believe I totally missed that part when you were reading, but it is interesting that those are the words that Jesus uses, and then eventually that does come to pass. But in the time in between, that is that weird, I don't know, I think we can all relate to it, that weird moment where it's okay, I've got nothing, and I fully trust that God is going to take care of everything because I don't know what to do. All that's left is to just simply have faith in what God promises.
Okay, so this is extra credit, and I don't know how I'm going to fit it in, so I'm just going to fit it in right here. Verse 37, the crowds actually reference the man who was born blind. So just because I'm kind of picking up that thread,
Ooh.
if you look at verse 37, this is Lazarus is dead at this point. He has not yet been raised. And the crowd says, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? So everybody's tying these two stories together.
Tuned in.
But rarely when we teach these stories do we tie them together, just because it's just not how we do it. But the big thing here is that Jesus hears that his friend is sick enough that his family is like emergency calling out, like, hey, you got to get here. What should get our attention is that he does not race to get there. He takes his time, which I think that is somewhat of what you're alluding to. He does not go right away. And even when Jesus tells the disciples that he has fallen asleep, they're like, okay, like he's fallen asleep. Like, let's go wake him up, I guess. Like that's verse 11. After saying these things, he said to them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. And like, they naturally are very confused. I think that is some of what you're already saying. Like they're assuming that he's going to be fine. And then he has to be more pointed, like, hey, actually, he is dead. And Lazarus dies. And so when Jesus shows up, again, 4 days late, he's already dead. What's interesting is we see here that Mary, in her interaction with Jesus, shows that she does believe in the resurrection, which would have been like kind of unique in this time. Jesus declares himself as the true resurrection and the life. But Martha is basically saying, like, I know that you are the resurrection. I believe that you are the Son of God. She just doesn't connect the dots that he intends to raise Lazarus that moment.
Well, even before that conversation, when you were talking about Jesus saying, like, I'm going to awaken him, the disciples are actually very confused too, because they are assuming he is literally talking about actual sleep, not death. And Jesus tells them in verse 14, at first, like, I had put these words into the disciples' mouths, but this is actually what Jesus said. Jesus says in verse 14, Lazarus has died. Like, he's the one that already knows and states it. And then he says, and for your sake, I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. So there's that piece again that like kind of got me earlier, where it's like, if you heard before that he's not going to die from this, but you also know now that he truly is dead, there is like a huge faith factor that has to be tied in there, because otherwise, like, what else is there? So that is really interesting too, that Jesus is the one that's like, well, he's not going to die from this, but also he did die. So where are you going to land in all of this?
Another really interesting extra credit piece here. The problem in the background is that when Jesus healed the blind man, he made this definitive statement that he is God, and the people tried to kill him. So then they like evacuated, basically, like they got away from this violent crowd. So the issue here in the background of this whole story is that to get to Lazarus, they have to go back to where that violent crowd is. They have to be back to where all those people are that want to kill Jesus. If you look at verse 16, when the disciples realize that they are going to go back, it says, so Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. Thomas understands that when Jesus goes back, his life is in danger. And Thomas is saying, like, okay, I'm ready to give my life with you, Jesus. And I love highlighting this because poor Thomas is known as who? What do we always call Thomas? Well, he certainly does not seem like a doubter here. He seems like somebody that is very committed to the cause and ready to give his life on behalf of Jesus. So just for Thomas's sake, so that we don't malign his name, he seems to be pretty firm in his belief here, not doubting at all.
So then we move into the actual place where Jesus arrives. He's talked to the sisters, and he goes out, and he's like, we have to go and get him. And they're like, it's going to stink. You don't want to go in there. It's been 4 days. He's been wrapped. Like, you don't want to go down
He's
there.
quite dead.
Yeah, right. And what really caught my attention was, like, everybody is obviously very moved and, like, very upset. They're mourning. And Jesus goes out to where he is. And verse 35 is, like, super popular, but I don't know that I've ever totally understood the context of it. The verse is, Jesus wept. And the significance of that is, like, you would think that he is weeping because he's, like, you know, sad that his friend is dead. But in reality, Jesus is actually weeping simply because like he has to deal with the fact that like death and suffering have to happen because of the fallen, broken state that we are in. So that is like, I don't know, that's just so interesting to me that like Jesus hates sin, death, and suffering so much, and it moves him to tears because he knows that we all have to experience it. Thankfully, we have Jesus who took our place. I mean, we still experience death and suffering, but eternally we are able to be with him.
This is a very significant part of this story. Like, you do not want to miss the detail that Jenny is speaking to. Jesus weeps. One, of course, he's sad, but he knows he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. So it doesn't make sense for him to be crying because Lazarus is dead, because he knows he's going to raise him from the dead. Jesus is crying because he is furious that we experience death and suffering
And separation.
and separation. Like, don't forget that Jesus is God. So this is evidence to us that God is sorrowful over the fact that we experience the results of the fall. We experience the results of our sin. God has not intended for us to experience those things. And God has always intended to restore us, to reconcile us. That's why he's like laid out this whole plan for us. Actually, tonight, right before Jenny and I started cutting this episode, I'm actually working on another podcast. We're kind of like bringing back God's whole story. If you followed me from there, me and another group of people are working on episodes for God's whole story. And tonight we were looking at Genesis 1-3, and it is really interesting how sin happens and the whole world is affected by sin, and God immediately gets to work putting together the plan for our reconciliation and restoration because he loves us. He cares about us. He wants us to be restored to relationship with him. And I think we see that in Genesis 1-3, but we also see it here in John 11:35 with Jesus crying because he's frustrated with the reality that we experience.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's just an interesting part of his humanity as well, because I think we can all feel that. Like, why do we need to experience death? It's because of that separation that has happened because of sin. So it's cool again to just see Jesus being that human form of God that shares similarities with us, those emotions that are really raw sometimes. So we move into the actual fact that Lazarus is raised. He comes out and he's, bound obviously because they prepared him for burial. And it's just like this really, I'm sure, super surreal moment. Like, I'd almost feel bad that I was the one that wrapped him up. Like, oh my goodness, this is so ridiculous. One thing to just kind of take from that is that Jesus reminds the disciples and those around him in verse 40. Actually, specifically, I think he's talking to Martha in this moment. He says, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So again, he's really emphasizing the fact that like what I say is going to happen is going to happen. Like, you just have to believe. Like, what I say as God, you can trust. And like, even if it sounds crazy or outlandish, it is true. And then from there, we have a bunch of people who again are out to kill Jesus. Surprise, surprise.
Actually, one of the outcomes of this whole story is that they are hardened in their hearts even more so. They're more committed now to killing Jesus than they even were before.
So crazy.
And part of the plan becomes that they have to kill Lazarus too. Because every time people saw Lazarus, they were reminded of the power of God because he used to be dead.
Yeah.
And he's not anymore. So it's like a literal, like that is a spiritual reality for all of us. We used to walk in death, but now we are alive. And hopefully when people see us, they are reminded of the power of God in our lives. So it's really important to catch that they wanted to kill Jesus and they wanted to kill Lazarus.
What about the widow's son? I mean, that makes me think back to that
too.
too.
Okay, so that's an interesting thing to bring up. Like, this is not the only person that Jesus raised from the dead. There are other people that Jesus raised from the dead. Lazarus, I guess, is just the most exciting story or something. I don't really know how to explain that, but
maybe he was in like hotter water at that point.
Yes, this is not the only time this happened. Just to call it out at the end of the chapter, so like they're hardened, they want even more to kill Jesus. The high priest at the time, Caiaphas, he accidentally prophesies. It's really interesting.
It's hard to tell what side he's on.
Well, he's not on Jesus' side.
Right, but when I first read it, I was like, wait a minute, I'm a little confused.
It's really interesting because he is the high priest, so he is like the representative of God to the people, and God uses him to speak the truth, even though he's rejecting Jesus. But he says, essentially what he says is like, it'd be better for us to kill this one guy so that this one guy this one guy dies for the nation instead of all of us losing everything. And essentially the prophecy is like, yes, Jesus is the one man who gave his life for all mankind.
Yeah.
And John is kind of writing a commentary on this in this book, saying like, yeah, it's crazy. He prophesied. He said that this would become true, and it is true. So I think your part from this story, one, this is just an incredible story. Like a great your part is just enjoy how cool this story is. Mm-hmm. Two, I think I just made the your part. Like it's so interesting to know that they wanted to kill Lazarus too. Because an authentic life that has been radically changed, like this dude was dead, he's not dead anymore, like that is an incredible witness to the power of Christ. And we have the opportunity to be an incredible witness to the power of Christ. When we authentically follow Jesus, people will see that we were once dead, but now we're alive. It reminds me of the blind guy from the chapter right before this. He was once blind, but now he sees. Mm-hmm. Like when our lives are transformed by Jesus, we have such a powerful witness and testimony to the authority, to the power that is in Jesus. So just like boldly walk that out. Don't be ashamed. Don't be afraid. Bring attention to Jesus in the way that you live your life today. We'll be back again tomorrow looking at John chapter 12. We'll see you then.
Thanks for joining today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. As always, please consider partnering with us as we are a listener-supported podcast that we hope to continue to grow with support from listeners just like you.
We've made it super easy to partner with us, and you can support us by following the link in our show notes or our description. You can support us with as little as $3 a month.
Every little bit of this helps so much, and we're so thankful for your support. With that in mind, here's today's reading.
John chapter 11. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to his disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going to go there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of the world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking a rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus was already in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he may die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, The teacher is here and calling for you. And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were there in her house consoling her saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews said, See how he loved him. But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of this blind man also have kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, Take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by the time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, Unbind him and let him go. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into the children of God those who are scattered abroad. So from that day on they made plans to put him to death. Jesus therefore no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness, to a town called Ephraim, and there he stayed with the disciples. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus and saying to one another as they stood in the temple, What do you think? That he will not come to the feast at all? Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should let them know, so that they might arrest him. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. Don't forget, you can find us on just about every social media platform and YouTube. Let us know what you thought of today's episode, and if you have any questions, go ahead and post them there. You can also reach out to us directly at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. As always, if you don't have a Bible, or if you'd like to use the one that we use, reach out to us via email and we'll be happy to send one to you. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you again tomorrow.